Remove her from this courtroom right now! I will have order in this courtroom!
Judge Benjamin thought he could ruin a young black attorney's career with a single, arrogant stroke of his gavel. He didn't just hold her in contempt. He laughed while she was LED away in handcuffs. But the smirk vanished when she returned an hour later, not as a prisoner but as his new boss. For 19 years, Marcus Benjamin had sat on that bench, believing the robe made him untouchable. He had learned over almost 2 decades exactly how far he could push before anyone dared to push back. And the answer in his experience had always been nowhere near far enough. Attorneys whispered his name in the hallways before they ever stepped into his courtroom. Young lawyers, especially the ones who didn't look like him, learned quickly that confidence in front of Judge Benjamin came with a price most of them weren't willing to pay. Denise Okafor had heard the warnings. She'd heard them from other public defenders, from clerks who rolled their eyes the moment his name came up, from attorneys twice her age who told her gently to just get through it and move on. But Denise had never been the type to shrink herself just to make a room more comfortable. She stood at the podium that morning with the same steady posture she carried into every courtroom, her voice calm, her point simple. "Your Honor, I'd like the record to reflect the discrepancy in the arrest report's timeline." She said nothing more than a routine clarification, the kind attorneys raised without a second thought. Judge Benjamin didn't let her finish. "Counsel, I don't need a lecture on what belongs in the record," he snapped, leaning forward with the same hardened expression. His clerks had learned to recognize as a warning sign, "Finish your point or sit down." She didn't waver with respect. "Your Honor, I'm only asking which timeline the court is proceeding under." For the appellate record, that was enough for him. His gavel came down hard, the crack of it splitting through the murmurs in the gallery. "That's contempt, counsel. You've tested this court's patience for the last time." A wave of disbelief moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable. A few attorneys exchanged glances, the kind that said everyone in that room had seen this happen before, and no one had ever done anything to stop it. Silence had always been safer. Standing up for someone else in Judge Benjamin's courtroom meant risking becoming his next target, and most people weren't willing to take that risk, not even for something as clearly unjust as this. 2 officers stepped forward from their post near the sidewall, their faces unreadable, trained to follow the order of the man on the bench without hesitation. No matter what their instinct told them about the situation unfolding in front of them, they took their positions on either side of Denise, each placing a hand gently but firmly on her arm, guiding her away from the podium the same way they'd guided 100 defendants before her, except this time, the person being LED away wasn't a defendant at all. She was counsel. She was doing her job. Denise didn't struggle. She didn't raise her voice or plead her case to a room that had already made its decision. She kept her chin level, her shoulders straight, every part of her holding on to the discipline that had gotten her through law school. Here's one of the only black women in her class. 3 years of being underestimated in rooms exactly like this one, through a career where she'd learned that dignity wasn't something you begged for. It was something you carried, no matter what anyone tried to take from you. One of the officers, older, with the kind of tired eyes that had clearly witnessed this exact scene play out more times than he cared to count, gave her the smallest nod as they walked her toward the side door. It wasn't much, it didn't undo what was happening. But it was something, a quiet acknowledgement between 2 people who both understood, in that moment, exactly how wrong this was, even if neither of them said it out loud. The cops in that courtroom weren't the ones who created the injustice. They were simply caught in the machinery of it, doing their job while a man with too much power for too long decided who deserved respect and who didn't. Judge Benjamin watched her go, with something close to satisfaction settling across his face, the particular kind of pride that men like him mistake for authority. He let out a short laugh, barely more than a breath, but loud enough for the clerks near his bench to hear it clearly. "Perhaps counsel will learn some respect for this bench," he said almost to himself, already reaching for his next file, as though nothing worth remembering had just taken place. But something worth remembering had just taken place, because as Denise was escorted through the hallway, her paralegal was already outside, phone against her ear, dialing a number she'd been given only that morning, a direct line to the State Judicial Oversight Office. The call lasted less than 4 minutes, and within that hour, the same hallway that had just carried Denise away in restraint would carry her back into that courtroom under entirely different circumstances, wearing a badge Judge Benjamin never once imagined she could hold. The officers who walked her out that morning had no idea they were witnessing the first minutes of the biggest professional reckoning their courthouse had seen in years. They were simply doing their jobs the same as they did every day, standing quietly at the center of a moment that history was about to remember. Long after that morning's docket was forgotten, the hallway outside Judge Benjamin's chambers was quieter than the courtroom had been, the kind of quiet that felt heavier somehow, thick with the residue of what had just happened only an hour earlier. Denise Okafor walked through that same corridor now, her heels striking the marble floor in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The same corridor she had been escorted through in restraint not so long ago. But everything about her had changed since then. Or rather, everything about how the world was about to see her had changed, because the truth about who she was had never actually shifted at all. She had simply been carrying it quietly, the way she'd learned to carry most things that mattered, without announcement, without needing anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. She paused for a moment, outside the heavy wooden door of his chambers, straightened the credential badge clipped to the inside of her coat, and allowed herself one breath, not out of nervousness, but out of respect for the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't about revenge, she reminded herself of that fact, the same way she'd reminded herself of it all morning, sitting in that holding room, watching the clock, waiting for the process to move exactly as it was supposed to. This was about accountability, plain and simple, the kind that rarely finds its way to have spent decades believing they were above it. Inside the chambers, Judge Benjamin sat behind his desk, still writing, the quiet satisfaction of a morning that had gone in his mind. Exactly the way mornings in his courtroom always went. He was reviewing paperwork when the knock came, soft and hesitant, the kind of knock that already told him something was wrong. Before a single word was spoken, his clerk stepped halfway into the room, her voice unsteady. "Judge Benjamin, there's someone here to see you from the State Judicial Council." He barely looked up. "Tell them." "I'm in the middle of something, sir." "I don't think this can wait." Something in her tone made him pause just for a second, though he brushed it off almost immediately, too used to being the most important person in any room to imagine otherwise. "Fine, send them in." The door opened fully, and Denise Okafor stepped inside. No handcuffs, no escort, just her own steady presence, and a thick folder tucked under one arm. For a moment, Judge Benjamin simply stared, his mind working to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with what he thought he already understood about the morning's events. The woman standing in his doorway was the same woman he had held in contempt only an hour earlier, the same woman he had watched being LED away while he let out that quiet, satisfied laugh. Except now she wore a credential badge he recognized instantly, one that belonged to an office most judges in that building both respected and feared in equal measure. "Excuse me," he said. Rising slightly from his chair, his voice caught somewhere between confusion and the beginning of alarm. "What is the meaning of this?" "Judge Benjamin," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying none of the anger he might have expected, and in some strange way might have found easier to face. "My name is Denise Okafor, Regional Judicial Compliance Administrator. I believe we met earlier today, under slightly different circumstances." The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel physical. Judge Benjamin's face shifted through several expressions in the span of a few seconds, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief giving way to something closer to dread. As the pieces began arranging themselves in his mind, every ruling he had made that morning, every sharp word, every dismissive wave of his hand, replayed itself in rapid succession, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the particular discomfort of being on the other side of scrutiny instead of the one delivering it. "This is," he started, then stopped, restarted, his usual command of the room nowhere to be found. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "No mistake," Denise said, stepping further into the room, her tone never rising, never needing to. "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing the compliance record for this district. I just didn't expect to become part of one of your rulings before I had the chance to introduce myself properly." She set the folder down on the edge of his desk, opened it with the same unhurried calm she'd carried since walking in, and placed a single page in front of him. He recognized it instantly, his own signature at the bottom, the contempt order he'd signed less than 2 hours earlier, the ink barely dry. He stared at it as though seeing it for the first time, as though the weight of what he'd done that morning had only just become real now that it was staring back at him on paper. What Judge Benjamin didn't know, what he was only now beginning to understand, was that Denise's role as a public defender had never been permanent. It had been a temporary bridge assignment, one she'd taken on months earlier while her appointment to the compliance office was finalized, behind the scenes quietly, the way most institutional changes happen, long before the public or the people affected by them ever find out. That morning's hearing hadn't been random. It had been the first scheduled stop in an audit of his own courtroom, an audit that had been building for months, based on patterns nobody in that building had wanted to address, until someone with enough authority finally could. The two officers who had escorted her out that same morning were now standing quietly near the outer office, having been asked to wait, uncertain themselves about what exactly was unfolding behind that door. They had done their jobs that morning, nothing more, nothing less, following an order from a judge they had no institutional reason to question in the moment. But standing there now waiting, they found themselves quietly reflecting on the small nod one of them had given her as she was LED away. The tired instinct that had told them something about that morning hadn't sat right, even if neither of them could have predicted exactly how right that instinct would turn out to be. Cops in rooms like that one are rarely the architects of injustice, but they are often its first witnesses, standing close enough to see it clearly, even when they aren't in a position to stop it. What mattered now was that the system, slow and imperfect as it often is, had found its way to catching up. Every ruling I've made has been within my discretion as a judge. Benjamin said, his voice quieter now, some of his usual authority visibly draining as he tried to recover ground that was no longer his to stand on. Discretion isn't the same as a pattern. Your Honor, Denise replied, her expression steady, her voice carrying the same calm she'd used at the podium. Only hours earlier, the same calm that had gotten her held in contempt in the first place, and a pattern is exactly what my office exists to investigate. He looked at her, then really looked at her, perhaps for the first time all morning, seeing not the young attorney he had dismissed without a second thought, but the woman who had spent years building a career on exactly the kind of quiet competence he had mistaken for weakness. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction mirroring the laugh he'd let out earlier that day. She hadn't come to embarrass him. She had come because it was her job. Because the same discipline that had carried her through that courtroom in restraint just hours earlier was the same discipline guiding her through this conversation now, without raised voices, without theatrics. Just the quiet, steady presence of someone who understood that real power rarely needs to announce itself. Outside, the two officers exchanged a glance. Neither of them fully understood, yet sensing only that something significant had shifted in that building, something far bigger than a single contempt charge or a single difficult morning. And inside those chambers, Judge Benjamin sat facing the woman he had underestimated just hours before, beginning to understand slowly and uncomfortably exactly how much was about to change. The hearing room felt different from the courtroom. Denise had stood in weeks earlier, quieter, more formal in a way that had nothing to do with theater and everything to do with consequence. There was no gallery of nervous spectators here, no gavel waiting to be slammed for effect. Just a long table, a panel of 5 reviewing officials seated behind it, and Judge Marcus Benjamin sitting alone on the other side. Stripped of the elevated bench that had defined nearly 2 decades of his career, for the first time in longer than anyone in that building could remember, he was the one being looked down upon, and the weight of that reversal seemed to settle into his shoulders. The moment he took his seat, the panel chair, a woman in her 60s, with decades of judicial oversight experience etched into the lines of her face, opened the folder in front of her and began reading through the findings in a steady, unemotional voice, the kind of voice reserved for moments that required absolute clarity. Judge Benjamin, this board has completed a comprehensive review of your courtroom conduct. Over the past 18 months, the findings are extensive, and frankly, they are deeply concerning. Benjamin sat still, his jaw tight, his hands folded in front of him, in a posture that might have looked composed to anyone who didn't know better. But Denise recognized it instantly, the same rigid control she'd seen in defendants trying to hold themselves together in the face of consequences they hadn't expected to face. Power, she had learned over the years, often looks the same on its way down as it does on its way up. The only difference is what's left standing underneath it. In the past year alone, the panel chair continued. You issued 61 contempt citations, 53 of them were against attorneys of color, a disproportionate rate that cannot be explained by caseload alone. Your reversal rate on appeal is the highest of any sitting judge in this circuit, a pattern that suggests not occasional error, but a systemic failure to apply the law evenly. Every ruling I've made has been within my discretion as a judge, Benjamin said, the same defense he'd offered Denise privately weeks earlier, though it sounded even thinner now, spoken aloud in front of people whose entire job was to see past exactly that kind of justification. Discretion protects judgment, the panel chair replied evenly. It does not protect bias. And the data in front of this board does not describe discretion. Judge Benjamin, it describes a pattern. Denise watched him carefully as those words landed. Watching 19 years of certainty crumble in real time across a man's face, she thought briefly of the two officers who had walked her out of that courtroom weeks earlier, their expressions unreadable in the moment, but their instincts she now understood, far sharper than they'd been given credit for. Cops in rooms like that rarely have the power to challenge a judge's order in the moment it's given, but they often carry the truth of what they witness long after the moment has passed. One of those officers had reached out to her office 2 weeks after that hearing, quietly off the record, offering to testify to a pattern of similar treatment he'd witnessed in that courtroom for years, but never had a channel to report. His statement, corroborated by 3 other officers who had served in that courthouse over the years, became one of the most significant pieces of evidence. In the entire review, Justice Denise had come to understand rarely moves through grand gestures. It moves through the quiet courage of people willing to say what they saw, even when silence would have been easier. Judge Benjamin, the panel chair, said, straightening the folder in front of her, effective immediately. You are suspended from the bench pending a formal misconduct hearing. During this suspension, you will not preside over any cases, and your conduct will remain under active review by this office. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or reach for the same authority that had defined him for 19 years, because there was nothing left in that room for that authority to command. 19 years, he said quietly, almost to himself, the words carrying less anger than a kind of hollow disbelief. A man realizing perhaps for the first time that the position he'd occupied had never made him untouchable, only unexamined outside the hearing room. The 2 officers who had first walked her through that hallway in handcuffs stood waiting, having been asked to provide brief statements as part of the closing proceedings. They didn't know Denise well, had exchanged only a few words with her since that morning, weeks earlier, but there was a quiet respect between them now, the kind that forms between people who have witnessed the same injustice from different sides and come out the other end with the same conclusion. When Denise passed them in the hallway after the hearing concluded, the older officer, the one who had given her that small, almost imperceptible nod as she was led away that first day, met her eyes and gave a short, respectful nod once more. You did the right thing, Denise told him quietly, pausing just long enough to say it directly. Speaking up, it mattered. He nodded again, something easing in his posture that had clearly been carried there for a long time. Should have said something years ago. He admitted didn't think anyone would listen. Someone's listening now, she said, and meant it, because the entire foundation of the work she did depended on exactly that belief, that when people finally found the courage to speak, the system needed to be ready to hear them. She walked out of that courthouse alone that afternoon, her credential catching the late afternoon light as the heavy doors closed behind her, but she didn't feel alone in any way. That mattered. She felt the weight of every attorney who had ever stood in a courtroom like that one, swallowing frustration. Because speaking up felt too dangerous. She felt the quiet responsibility of every officer who had ever witnessed something wrong and stayed silent out of uncertainty rather than indifference, and she felt most of all the responsibility of making sure the very system that had once tried to silence her never got the chance to silence anyone else the same way. What happened to Judge Benjamin wasn't about revenge, and it was never meant to be. It was about a country still learning slowly and imperfectly that accountability has to apply to everyone who holds power, no matter how untouchable that power feels from the inside. It was about the quiet strength of a black woman who refused to shrink herself even in handcuffs, and the quiet courage of officers who chose eventually to tell the truth about what they'd seen. Real change rarely arrives with fireworks. Most of the time it arrives exactly like this. In a folder placed carefully on a desk, in a statement finally spoken after years of silence, in a woman walking out of a courthouse with her head held high, carrying nothing but the truth and the quiet certainty that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always worth it in the end.